Welcome to this webinar to present the results of a study we conducted over the last few months. Some of you are already familiar with the study from what I can see in the chat, so it's great to have you with us this afternoon or morning, depending on where you're based. My name is Pauline Payet. I'm a senior analyst in the Defense and Security team at RAND, and together with other members of the project team, we'll present you the findings of our study. In addition to this presentation that we will be conducted in the first part of the webinar, Ben Holt from the International Federation of the Red Cross will be moderating the Q&A discussion that will follow, and will provide some reflections as well on the project and the various activities that we've been conducted. If I can, just a little bit of housekeeping before we actually start the presentation. So feel free to post questions in the chat during the presentation, and once we enter the Q&A part of the webinar, you can either post your questions in the chat again, or if you want to directly speak up, please raise your hands and ask your questions. If it's directed to someone in particular, please feel free to mention it, so we can also make sure that your questions are addressed to the relevant people in the virtual room. I don't think I've missed anything, but let me know if please put in the chat if anything isn't clear. So if we could move to the next slide, we'll give you a little bit of an overview of what the agenda for the presentation and the rest of the session will be. So we'll first give you a bit of an overview of what the project was about and what we did. And then the subsequent sections will go into some of the specific activities that we've conducted and the emerging findings we're able to identify throughout the project. Once this is finished and we've presented the Emerging Technology Translation Initiative, we'll then kind of pause to get some reflections from Ben, and then we'll open the floor to the audience for other questions. And we'll finally wrap up the session at around 2:30 UK time. I'm not sure exactly what this means for everyone, depending on where you're based, but this is kind of the plan for the session. So if we can now go to the next slide, and I'll let the UKHH team share a bit more details about what this project was and the rationale behind it.
Thank you, Pauline. My name is Sian White. I'm the director of the UK Humanitarian Innovation Hub, which is hosted at ORA and supported by the UK government. So we are a small pilot initiative, which means many of you may not have come across us before, but we focus on trying to harness UK and international capabilities to undertake both responsive research and problem-led systems innovation in the humanitarian sector. And we often focus on topics like this, where there's a clear potential promise. And as we operate in a world where we all recognize that we're having to meet greater humanitarian needs with finite resources, we often look towards things like emerging technologies with great hope that they can perhaps improve the efficiency and effectiveness and acceptability of the way that we deliver humanitarian response. But we all know, I think, that technology is also not a simple silver bullet to all of that, and that there will be definitely challenges in terms of navigating ethical principles and humanitarian principles and being able to translate technologies in some of the most complex environments globally. And so for us, this is a particularly pertinent topic. We believe that often when it comes to these complex challenges for the humanitarian sector, the right expertise does actually exist globally, but it's about how we connect and leverage that. It's also about how we begin to bridge kind of language divides between those who might be technical experts and those with the experience of delivering humanitarian response programs. And so the UKHIH really hopes to create through an evidence-based approach to engaging a range of stakeholders in this topic. And that's why we're really excited to see so many of you on this call today, and having read through the chat at also individuals who are clearly in a position to hopefully take some of these insights forward. So thank you all for joining, and I'll hand back to hear the findings.
Many thanks, Jan. So now if we move into the project more specifically. So this is a project that was kind of had three main objectives. And I should mention that in the context of this project specifically, we focused on emerging technologies, but AI-related developments were kind of out of scope and are the subject of a dedicated adjacent project also conducted by UKHH. So in terms of the specific objectives that this project had, so the objective was to first kind of develop a better understanding of what humanitarian challenges were and how this related to emerging technologies. And the timeframe we considered for the project was out to 2030. Then based on this initial scoping phase, the second objective was to understand how emerging technologies could have a potential added value for the humanitarian sector and trying to identify future development pathways of these promising technologies. And a third objective of the study, as you can see on the slide, was to identify potential opportunities in terms of like guidance for the deployment of these emerging technologies, but also focus on a more futures-oriented approach and how to and consider how to integrate foresight methods and develop a futures-oriented approach within the sector beyond shorter-term timeframes that are oftentimes what the sector operates under. And in addition to the core objectives of this specific project, we also conducted two additional activities that related to technology areas that are currently used and adopted in the sector, and try to identify what were the kind of preconditions that enabled these adoptions. So we focused on technology-enabled cash and voucher initiatives, and also considered the use of biometrics. And if this is of interest, we're not going to present those two case studies in much detail during the presentation, but if this is of interest, we're really happy to discuss these two more during the discussion session. So now if we move on to the next slide. So first of all, before kind of delving into some of the specific activities and finding, we'll provide you with a bit of an overview of what the study methodology and approach was. And if we move on to the next slide. So basically, the study was divided into three phases that more or less correspond to the three objectives that I just presented. And for each of those phases, we conducted a number of activities that were also aligned with the kind of core principles of the project. And these were to be focused on the challenges that the humanitarian sector faces in relation to the adoption of use of emerging technologies, but also conduct a bit of an exploratory study of how could these technologies be beneficial for the sector. We also really wanted to include as many stakeholders from the sector, but also those that are familiar with futures and foresight, as well as emerging technologies, both in a more high level, but also quite specific and focused dimension. And to do this, we also aim to be as inclusive as possible, which we'll touch upon later, but inclusivity remains a core challenge in this area. So if we move on to the next slide, I'll let my colleague Sergi come in and explain a little bit to you how we used the tools developed by Glass AI for the study.
Thank you, Pauline, and hello, everyone. My name is Sergi Martorell. I'm one of the co-founders of Glass AI. Just quick background, we've built an AI research capability that deep reads the public web to research organizations and sectors globally. So we can do this across languages and countries. So one of the key tasks in phase one, as Pauline mentioned, was systems mapping. And that involved building a large database of humanitarian organizations that then we could research further to understand how they talk and use emerging technologies and what sort of challenges these organizations are facing. So what we did at Glass AI is we applied our AI research capability to read the global web. That included organizations' websites, several million news sources, social media, official sources, and also sector-related sources. And the aim was to discover and map the humanitarian sector globally, something that had not been done at this scale before. After several iterations, we ended up with a database of more than 11,000 organizations, 2,000 of which are core humanitarian organizations, 4,000 are related in the sector, and then think tanks, policy research organizations, and also some economic development organizations that were kept separate. Once we built this baseline of several thousand humanitarian organizations in different countries, what we did is we deep read the websites of these organizations to understand the sort of emerging technologies that they might be talking about using, and also the challenges associated with the use of those technologies. This was done through a combination of understanding the content and then comparing the results with a separate desktop research that had been conducted by RAND. Later on, we also ran a deep dive on 5 specific emerging technologies. But essentially, we built a very large evidence base for the study to then go deeper into the emerging technologies and challenges that these organizations are facing. So this is a quick summary. Over to you, Pauline.
Thanks a lot, Sergi. So I don't know if you want to mention a little bit about the challenges specifically. I mean, I can also do that because so basically what the result of the mapping and the web reading that Glass AI did enabled us, as Sergi mentioned, to identify relevant organizations, but also to understand and map challenges on various themes. And we tried to identify challenges that related both to ethical, legal, operational, technical, and systemic challenges. And to kind of support some of these activities, some kind of challenges were also mentioned during some of the scoping interviews we did. And I think some of the kind of recurring themes with regards to challenges related to privacy-related issues, how to reach populations, but also north-south divide, and also the kind of vertical donor approach that can be challenging. I think what's important to know as well in terms of the challenges and how this relates to emerging technology is that most of the technologies that we've identified as part of step 1 and the scoping phase suggested that these technologies could be causes, but also solutions to the challenges that we've identified. So for example, energy availability or poverty can be addressed, or technologies can help address these challenges, but they also bring their own challenges in terms of like surveillance or data sovereignty related issues. So I think the kind of dual aspect of emerging technologies in this regard is quite interesting as well, and something that we also found in the evidence. So if we now go to the next slide. So in terms of the kind of results of the mapping and horizon scanning approach we undertook, so we identified some technology signals that were kind of clues of how emerging technologies could be really promising for the sector. And then we kind of conducted some additional activities to consolidate those into 50 technology areas. And these were based on kind of the specific links to the challenges that we had identified for the sector, but also like a mapping against the cluster approach developed by the UN in terms of humanitarian activities. So I think overall the kind of some themes were quite recurring in terms of both the challenges, but also in relation to the technology developments. So those related, for example, about health-related issues, but also logistics and supply chain security, for example, but also some cross-cutting technologies that could be applied to different types of humanitarian activities. Some perhaps less common themes that came up as a result of the mapping activities that we did related to nutrition, shelter, and education as well. It's important as well to highlight that the innovations were often, or emerging technology areas were often related to the scale or speed of development, of deployment that could support humanitarian activities, in terms of like increasing the responsiveness of the humanitarian sector to a crisis, or to be able to kind of deploy to more locations or hard to access locations, for example. And it should also be noted that the kind of in the 50 technology areas that were kind of mapped and consolidated by the study team, there is also a balance between some of those more high-tech solutions that maybe are at the moment a bit less developed, with more frugal innovations that relate to primary, to core humanitarian activities as well. So if we move on to the next slide now. So in terms of like, from these initial mapping and the results of this, we then kind of moved on to trying to understand the impact of these technologies. And then I'll give the mic back to Shruti to tell us a little bit more about the engagements that we conducted with the sector on this.
Thank you, Pauline. I mean, one of the things that I do want to emphasize, and just picking up on something that Sean mentioned at the beginning, right, is for this research, the acknowledgement that tech doesn't operate in a vacuum, that when we're talking about specific technologies, we're also aware that they are embedded in power structures. There's a lot of politics in how they are being implemented. And it's really important for them to work with the communities where this tech is being deployed. And I think, personally, for me, this feels like a particularly dystopian time to speak about the use of tech in humanitarian areas, because I think over the past year, we've seen how tech can be used in incredibly destructive ways, whether that's through the use of drone warfare or AI-generated kill lists, to wreak incredible damage on communities, right? Especially what we've seen come out of West Asia and Gaza. So it's really important for us to talk about what are the ethical challenges, what are the guardrails that we need to set up as humanitarians to ensure that this technology is being used well, and to openly acknowledge what the challenges are. I think one thing that we did notice quite a lot in the research is talk of the technology without talking of the context in which it was being implemented, and without talking about the very real challenges in implementing, or very real ethical and human challenges in implementing it. So one of the things that we did do is conduct ethics workshops with humanitarians. We conducted 2 workshops, and we were quite keen to ensure diversity in location. So our workshops included individuals who were driving strategy for humanitarian organizations in headquarters, but also individuals who were leading humanitarian implementation of these programs. And on that slide, you can see some of the key challenges that people identified in the use of technology within humanitarian programs. I'll just touch upon a couple, which I thought were really important for us to talk about today. One was a tendency to discuss the use of tech or guidelines around the ethics of tech in a top-down standards way. Standards that are set up in headquarters and then communicated to different offices of which are implementing the use of tech, right? And this created issues both in terms of localized needs and resources, but also in terms of the language that was being used to talk about technology and how it's being implemented. So the need to move away from top-down standards to more community-led or community collaborative innovation and guidelines around this. Data privacy, extractivism was something that was often raised. Data colonialism was a term that came up quite a lot. The use of data that is being generated by individuals, often in vulnerable conditions and in need of humanitarian aid, without a real understanding of how this data is going to be used downstream, whether for economic or other kinds of benefits, right? Another concern that came up quite a lot was data that's collected by humanitarian organizations, but then the risk of this data being either being accessed by government players or non-governmental players, where there's a strong suspicion that this data is then going to be used to cause harm to certain communities. And there were examples that came up in these workshops of humanitarian organizations finding themselves in a tough situation, especially when host governments request some data. So how do you guard against this? One thing that, I mean, these are really tough questions, right? We don't have the answers, but what did come across really clearly was that all humanitarian organizations are dealing with these questions, sometimes in connected ways and sometimes in very siloed ways. But the questions that they're dealing with are the same. And often, like, these technologies are already on ground, right? In a way, our ethical and governance standards are catching up to the implementation of this technology. And so that catch up needs to be much faster. On a more optimistic note, I think what came across was the principles that everyone agreed were important to govern the ethical aspects of tech use were the same as the rest of the humanitarian sector, right? Whether that's a do no harm principle, whether it's community-led collaboration, whether it's inclusivity. Those are principles that govern all our work within the humanitarian sector. And therefore, the tech is moving fast. It's moving in ways that we cannot currently fathom. But the principles that we want to use to think about this tech and its implementation are quite consistent across different technologies. I'll stop there. Pauline.
Thanks a lot, Shruti. So based on the workshops we've conducted, we also did a survey with humanitarian organizations and stakeholders to identify both what the challenges could be, but also what are potential promising technology areas that could be used further in the sector. We identified 5 technology areas that could be further developed over the next few years. And my colleague James is going to talk a little bit more about what we found for each of those. But basically, from the results of our activities, it appears that service coordination and aggregation platforms and ensuring that there is an increase in information sharing across the sector is quite important and could be further enhanced. There are also, in relations to the ethical concerns, the development of privacy enhancing technologies that relate to data collection and information sharing as well. We identified as well that early warning system in the context of climate disaster, but also other types of crises, could be further developed, especially in low and middle income countries. And the last 2 areas that we found to be promising areas for the sectors are camp monitoring systems with the kind of diversification of settlements and types of settlements across the sector, but also the use of advanced manufacturing technologies that could be used in different settings, including to manage those camps and settlements, but also to respond to other types of needs. So if we go to the next slide, I'll present briefly what the process was to develop those deep dives, and then I'll let my colleague James present kind of what the findings were for each of those 5 areas I've just presented. So to try and understand how each of these 5 technology areas could develop between now and 2030, we used what's called a 3-horizon framework. So basically, the first horizon is kind of what is happening at present. The third horizon is like what you envisage for the time frame you're considering. So for us, it's what's going to happen in 2030. And then the second horizon is kind of the juncture between those 2 horizons. So it's to identify what are the key elements that could lead either to the desired future, but also could act as barriers to these developments. So this was quite of a short overview of the framework that we used. And then James, if you want to come in and kind of say a few words for each of these areas.
Perfect. Hi, everyone. So my name is James from Round Europe, and I'll be presenting the 5 technology deep dives that we conducted. And the first one is advanced manufacturing, which refers to systems that hold potential advantages over conventional manufacturing approaches in terms of tailoring and adapting product design, improving energy and material usage efficiency, reducing infrastructure, technical capabilities, and resource needs, or enabling the use of a broader range of feedstocks. So I can walk through a few examples of the different technologies we found in the different horizons that Pauline identified. So in Horizon 1, which are applications that already exist, but we anticipate could be adopted more widely, we have 3D printing, for instance, of PPE masks and tourniquets. And there's also a range of challenges with these applications, including ensuring sustained funding for ensuring sustained funding for developing communities of practice and ensuring kind of continuous access to resources. In Horizon 2, we have technologies which are a little bit further out, but we anticipate could become relevant for the sector in the medium term. And these include mobile manufacturing facilities, open source hardware for non-regulated products, telemanufacturing, and 3D printed forensics. These applications have a lot of potential, for instance, by enabling distribution of manufacturing capacity according to needs through mobile facilities. And this can be especially valuable in emergency situations, such as floods, earthquakes, and fires that may disrupt traditional supply chains. Finally, in Horizon 3, which is a kind of longer term, we found examples of bioprinting, organic feedstocks, open source hardware for regulated products, and additive food manufacturing. This is also especially relevant in situations where medical supply chains in particular are disrupted or poor, and these technologies can offer standardized and regulated repair and production of medical equipment. However, many of these technologies are currently fairly far off, but they may have potential, and we speculate that they may have applications for the sector longer term. So finally, and I'll try and be brief because we have 5 of these, and we started thinking about the implications of these for the sector and some kind of areas we want to highlight for future consideration. So first, how can humanitarian makerspaces and distributed manufacturing networks be supported to scale? 3D printing has been applied throughout the sector, for instance, producing medical and emergency equipment in Iraq and Turkey, and scaling these applications could be potentially really valuable. Second, we think it's important to consider how funders, policymakers, and advocacy groups collaboratively develop new approaches for certifying open source hardware and designs. This is another major challenge for the advanced manufacturing, since some medical devices are highly complex and need to be certified to ensure they're safely produced, which is currently leads to prohibitively long approval processes and expenses. And then finally, how can locally abundant manufacturing feedstocks, including organic substances and bioinks, be identified and sustainably scaled? Early stage research has shown the potential to use feedstocks such as sand and mycelium materials as an input for 3D printing. And this has potential benefits both in terms of managing the ecological impacts of advanced manufacturing and lowering the barriers for the use of lower resource contexts. So now on the second deep dive, on the next slide, we looked at early warning systems for low and middle income countries, which we defined as systems for monitoring, forecasting, and communicating humanitarian disaster risks and enabling communities, governments, and businesses and others to take advantage and reduce the impacts of these risks in advance. As in the previous slide, I'll walk through a few examples of technologies which we identified in 3 horizons. So in Horizon 1, we identified multi-hazard warning systems, standard sensor technologies, community early warning systems, and mobile alert systems. In Horizon 2, the kind of medium term, we identified IoT, low-cost sensors, virtual reality for preparedness, and community-driven early warning systems. And then finally, in the longer-term horizon, we placed AI-enabled WES, PETs for early warning systems, and advanced MHEWS, for instance, for online misinformation or epidemics. And then as a barrier for developing these technologies, research suggested that there's a need to enhance the interoperability and integration among these systems, particularly in addressing multi-hazard situations. For instance, research identified cases of simultaneous operation of multiple early warning systems without coherent integration, which may raise concerns about the efficiency and effectiveness of kind of operating multiple systems at the same time. And then finally, as for the previous deep dive, we've highlighted a few areas for future consideration. So, for instance, what initiatives are needed to sustain early warning systems in low and middle income countries after the conclusion of the UN's Early Warning Systems for All initiative in 2027. Second, what approaches can ensure that LMICs can design and audit AI-based early warning systems in their community? And then finally, how can early warning communication systems be made more inclusive? For instance, reflecting local religious and spiritual beliefs. And then we also looked at camp monitoring systems in the third deep dive. And these refer to systems to monitor refugee camps and other temporary settlements through the use of technologies such as remote sensors, cameras, and other monitoring devices to track the activity of people, infrastructure, and goods. As before, I'll walk through the different technologies that are relevant in the 3 horizons. In Horizon 1, we have technologies such as fire alert systems, remote sensors, and security surveillance. These have been implemented through numerous systems, for instance, at the external borders of Schengen, to monitor physical threats within camps based on drones and sensors. However, these systems have come under criticism and investigation due to privacy and data protection violations. So while there are arguments that they may have potential security benefits, they're also very controversial, and there are a lot of concerns when it comes to the well-being and fundamental rights of migrants arising from these systems. Then in Horizon 2, the medium term, we have camp health monitoring and shelter monitoring. These offer examples of the use of the Internet of Things to monitor basic camp infrastructure as camps grow in population and physical complexity. And it's essential to ensure that people have basic needs when living within the camps met. And then finally, in the long-term horizon, we have digital twins of camps, disaster resilient monitoring technologies, and advanced smart city technologies. In this case, we see approaches of technologies developed elsewhere, such as digital twins and smart city methodologies, which can help to plan and monitor physical infrastructure, having potential within the humanitarian sector. We also see increasing concerns about the need for refugee camps to be resilient to the changes brought about by climate change, including extreme weather like heat waves, hurricanes, land and soil erosion, and floods. And then finally, we have a few considerations to keep in mind when looking at camp monitoring systems. First and foremost, we have how can camp monitoring systems avoid unwarranted surveillance of camp inhabitants and humanitarian workers? How could camp monitoring tools such as digital twins or camp infrastructure monitoring be used to better empower camp inhabitants? And then how could camp monitoring systems be used to, or kind of be made more resilient to the, and be used to address increasing camp exposure to climate risk. And then on the fourth deep dive, we looked at platforms for humanitarian collaboration, which refers to online platforms that enable multiple humanitarian actors to collaborate, enhance the quality of services, promote mutual accountability, or enable the pooling and sharing of resources and information. In the first horizon of present applications, we identified or research identified operation coordination platforms, service marketplaces, resource pooling platforms. And then in Horizon 2, we identified conversational AI, agent integrations, embedded data analysis, and merging and scaling of platforms. And then finally, in the longer term horizon, we identified LMIC-led collective crisis intelligence, for instance, crowdsourcing identification of risky terrain, and platforms combining with the Internet of Emergency Services. As a key enabler in the medium term of these technologies, participants in the research identified open technical standards and protocol for information sharing, including within LMICs, as having the potential to ease the process of data sharing and aggregation between different organizations. And then, as before, we have a few areas for future consideration when looking at these technologies. First, how can platforms be protected against increasingly severe cyber threats, such as ransomware or database hacking? Second, how can humanitarian actors manage the risks of AI integration to platforms, for instance, through conversational agents? And then finally, how can community-led development of platforms be better supported, such as through co-design approaches or low-code software? And then finally, we have our fifth deep dive on privacy-enhancing technologies, or PETs, which we defined as hardware and software solutions that protect data privacy while allowing responsible and secure use of the data, including data obfuscation, enabling data analysis without revealing data, encryption, and the usage of usage transparency and accountability mechanisms. In Horizon 1, the kind of present horizon, we identified secure messaging, cryptographic file sharing, data pseudonymization. In Horizon 2, which is the medium term, we identified privacy preserving identity management and data matching. And then finally, in Horizon 3, which is the longer term kind of areas that we view as having potential promise within the sector, a little bit further out, we found examples of next generation encryption, cryptographic tools, security enhancing systems, and portable personal data storage. However, there's a range of barriers to privacy enhancing technologies within the humanitarian sector that were identified in the research. For instance, the costs and present geographical spread of PET research and innovation clusters mean that in the short term, development of PETs is likely to be led by non-LMIC countries, which creates risks of potential power imbalances between PET developers and the communities impacted by them, and potentially a lack of regional applicability where PETs haven't been designed for use cases within regions where they're needed. And then finally, we have a few areas of consideration for PETs. So first, how can LMIC actors be supported to access PETs that are currently costly and complex? How could personal data stores for crisis-affected populations be developed to earn the trust of those communities? And finally, how can the humanitarian sector support the development of governance mechanisms to promote trustworthy PETs? Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, James. And maybe to quickly mention that for each of the horizons, so what's happening currently is based on existing development, including pilot projects in the sector. But in terms of Horizon 2 and 3, those are more kind of aspirational to some extent, that they are promising developments in the sector, but it doesn't mean that for each of the 5 areas that we've considered, there are tangible projects currently being conducted at a large scale. I think one of the findings as well that is valid across all of the deliverables that we've published in the context of this project is that often emerging technologies are kind of tested through a pilot project in a specific context, but that the replicability of that first pilot or test case has not necessarily kind of translated into a wider, larger scale or has been replicated across different contexts. So yeah, we can discuss those deep dives more during the discussion if that's of interest. So in addition to kind of looking specifically at promising technology areas that could be of use in the sector, one of the kind of objectives of the project was also to understand how could the deployment of emerging technologies could be facilitated. And so to do so, we developed some sort of guidance that could help the sector either looking to deploy specific technologies, but also trying to understand what is necessary to undertake in terms of activities to ensure that these technologies are deployed in a way that is suitable with the context in which they are deployed. So I'll let my colleague Anton kind of present to you how we developed the guidance and what were the kind of findings and different steps that you can now see on the slide.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Pauline. So as Pauline mentioned, sort of building on the desk research and stakeholder engagement activities that we conducted, the study team sort of sought to develop an understanding of where the opportunities lie for responsible technology guidance and then produce a document which humanitarian practitioners can then use to guide technology implementation, as well as their own technology-specific development of guidance that they can deploy themselves to end users of technologies. So throughout our guidance document, which you can see the graphic of here, we sought to reflect the need for general principles to guide these processes and wanted to allow for the likelihood of alterations based on specific needs of particular organizations, as well as the specific needs associated with particular technologies. So here you can see the visual representation of the guidance that the study team developed. I'll spend a few minutes just going through how we built the structure of the diagram and describe some key elements at each stage, as well as highlight some general considerations that should underpin all thinking throughout this document. It's important to note that we did develop this structure not as a rigid set of processes, but as a tool to give users an idea about roughly what they should be considering in each step in the technology selection, scoping, guidance development, and technology deployment processes. And crucially, to highlight that the purpose of this document is to translate the evidence that we gathered throughout this entire study into practice and to support humanitarian stakeholders when they're both deciding on and implementing technology programs and when they are themselves supporting stakeholders that they work with. It's important to note as well, we try to avoid reinventing the wheel and so have drawn on additional guidance that's already out there, including the ALRA Humanitarian Innovation Guide where it's applicable. And then, so in terms of the guidance itself, broadly, as you can see, the flow is quite intuitive. So stakeholders must first determine whether a challenge requires a technological solution. Then they select a technology. They seek to understand then how it might work in a given context. And then they develop guidance for the use of the technology in that context. Then when the technology and the guidance is deployed, stakeholders should then continuously assess that the technology is indeed fit for purpose and that it meets the needs of various stakeholders using appropriate monitoring metrics. And so at each stage that you see here, there are a few key elements that should be considered. So in step 0, this involves a very high-level view of technology implementation and choice strategy and how stakeholders will be incorporated. A key consideration that you see here is whether a technology should be used at all, incorporating technology skeptic as well as technology optimistic views. So there is an element of preparation that goes into this that we detail more in the final deliverables, which is namely highlighting the need to consider which challenges users aim to address with the technology and what existing solutions can be applied to them, whether they're technological or non-technological. Building on step 0 as sort of a prerequisite, users of our guidance document may then proceed to step 1, which is the technology selection stage. So this stage incorporates design decisions with the aim to tailor technology choice specifically to the needs of the context and to avoid duplication of past work, including building on best practice that might have been exemplified in other settings. Here, too, a healthy dose of skepticism we found could be useful, particularly when thinking about the various potential risks that might be associated with different technological solutions, as well as regulatory and financial considerations, and how they weigh up next to the purported benefits of using these technologies. Moving on then to step 2, this involves a further analysis and understanding of what exactly the context for technology implementation is. And it involves asking big questions indeed about leveraging internal and external stakeholders and about how best practice can be supported. So this stage also involves the consideration of risks, including data privacy and security, and a consideration of how these risks need to be mitigated in practice. Step 2 is therefore an essential prerequisite for step 3, which involves the development of guidance for stakeholders to use when implementing a technology program. So users of guidance that humanitarian stakeholders can develop should ensure that can be assured that guidance is inclusive and sensitive to the context that users exist within, and that it's accessible to them both linguistically and physically. So our guidance therefore helps humanitarian stakeholders to develop good guidance using the prompts that you can see here. And so we stress that while steps 3 and 4 are presented separately, they should be treated as iterative and sometimes simultaneous steps. So ongoing evaluation of technology implementation and use and of guidance deployment should be pursued. And the prompts we present here give users of our guidance some help in identifying and focusing on the key issues in these ongoing processes. At the bottom, you'll also see there are some overarching considerations drawn from our stakeholder research, and these can vary a lot. So first of all, they do include the consideration and leveraging of local communities' knowledge and continuous engagement with guidance users and affected communities. We did have a case study which looked at the cash distribution program, which focused on handing out mobile phones to teenage girls, which obviously on paper has some really large potential benefits, but in practice, there were some social barriers associated with that. A couple other overarching considerations that we wanted to highlight as well include built-in internal and external communication mechanisms into technology programs and the consideration and centering of humanitarian values and principles. And with that, I'll hand back over to Pauline on opportunities for technology foresight initiatives.
Many thanks, Anthony. And yeah, I think from the guidance, but also from the deep dives, something that we're not necessarily arguing for is the adoption and use of technologies. I think determining whether technological solutions are best suited for the issues that arise in the sector are one of the considerations, but that is not necessarily the unique answer to the question. So hopefully those developments in cases where there's a sense that technology can be part of the solution or the solution in some specific cases, the consideration around ethics and the respect of humanitarian principles is something that we've tried to emphasize as much as possible throughout our work, but also making sure that this is something that is in the mind of those actually developing the technologies, be it within the communities or more at kind of headquarters and tech companies level. So in addition to this guidance and the kind of looking at promising technology areas, we also try to consider what could foresight look like in the context of emerging technologies in the humanitarian sector. So if we go to the next slide. So I'm going to present one of the 3 concepts that we developed in a bit further detail, but basically we did adopt a similar approach for each of these foresight concepts. And what we try to understand is how these concepts could be developed in the humanitarian sector based on current practice and familiarity with foresight, but also whether this was something that would require additional partnerships or collaborations with existing or other types of stakeholders than the humanitarian sector might be used to, and also trying to consider, again, what the ethical concerns could be in relation to the development of these concepts. So we initially developed three ideas for what these initiatives could look like. And the first one was to build a kind of coalition of the willing, if you want, within the sector, trying to kind of monitor and keep track of emerging technological developments and make sure that there is some sort of information sharing on the technological developments themselves, but also trying to identify potential risks, challenges, as well as opportunities or enablers that would emerge from technological developments. And this would be based on kind of regular engagements between the various parties to this initiative, and also leverage collective intelligence practices that already exist within the sector. In terms of the second initiative that we kind of considered, would be the use of participatory approaches to enable foster faster recovery with affected communities and crisis affected communities. And in that process, the visioning would be to focus on the role of emerging technologies in the response to crisis and humanitarian response at large. And the third concept that we developed, that I'm going to develop a little bit more in the next slide, but we can stay on this one for now. So is to develop an emerging technology narrative initiative. And what this entails would be very much to kind of understand how emerging technologies are envisioned and conceptualized across a number of different crisis-affected communities, and trying to understand what narratives could be developed around these emerging technologies, making sure that concepts are similar or can be adapted from one local context to the next. For example, they might not always be a specific term to designate a technology, and that the English word would be kind of used when there might be another way to think and conceptualize technologies. And also this could help bring up some ethical concerns or potential risks and challenges that do come from these technologies as they are developed and potentially adopted within the sector. So if we go to the next slide, I'll briefly kind of explain how each of these concepts were developed, and we'll focus on the translation narrative to give you an idea of what we did exactly. But basically, the idea was to, again, have a framework that would enable us to develop some sort of ideas of what activities could be deployed to try and realize this concept. So basically, in terms on the kind of left-hand side in purple, you have in purple the inputs. So what types of data do you need to complete this concept? And then in blue, the kind of foresight part is what activities will be undertaken, and how will the inputs be kind of analyzed and used in kind of a foresight-oriented approach to support the initiative. Then in terms of outputs, this is about trying to kind of communicate the the results of those activities, and then the strategy will be more how can we act on the various inputs that have been highlighted. So in terms of practical activities for the purple part, this could be like a scoping activity, trying to understand what different emerging technologies are deployed across different types of regions, either at the very local level or at a more regional level, trying to understand what types of like partnerships could be further investigated, and what types of stakeholders you want to include in this initiative as well, either local communities themselves and like social civil society organization, non-profit organizations, as well as potentially technology development companies, and then trying to understand what are the kind of narrative analysis that will be kind of necessary to understand from the selected technologies what this could look like. So I think then in terms of like foresight, you could conduct some workshops to try and understand across different communities from the stakeholders you've recruited, how these are kind of built and how do these compare across the various contexts that you have considered, and then do some kind of testing, I guess, around the various narratives, whether these resonate with the local communities that you aim to reach, or whether they are not really aligned with the local conceptualization, of an emerging technology area. So I think then in terms of output, this is very much about developing a toolkit and trying to foster the adoption of common narratives around these emerging technologies, and then kind of develop wider kind of information sharing mechanisms, as well as like campaigns to promote those narratives, and also build capacity within the communities you're looking to engage. So yeah, these are kind of, this is a really quick overview of the various activities we've conducted during the project, and some of the findings that we came across. And I think I'll pause here and then we can go into some reflections and open the floor to.
Thank you, Pauline. That was a really interesting presentation. And yeah, we're going to open the space to some reflections and some questions. To sort of put it in context, I've not been part of the development of this work, but a kind of interested onlooker. And my role is currently with the International Federation of the Red Cross, Red Crescent. But I have a background in tech innovation within the sector. So it's great to see this kind of work coming to the fore. As it was being presented, it made me think that there's a whole bunch of new kind of concepts and languages in here, as well as the new technologies themselves. And we should start to think not just sort of how we change what we do, or even changing the things that we do, but changing how we think about the work that we do, what we conceive of as good humanitarian services, collaborations, presence, responsiveness. And I was really sort of heartened to hear Sean at the beginning talk about systems innovation, trying to influence things beyond that single product level, to recognize that we're part of a complex ecosystem. And there's all sorts of barriers to change within that. But we can be very proactive, right? We can have a positive influence by exploring the possibilities, by looking ahead, as well as continuing to deliver the kind of urgent aid and support that we are known for. But just because we're crisis response, in many cases, shouldn't mean that we are acting after the fact all the time. We can actively shape how these technologies evolve and the impact that they have. And I think that's where the foresight and the futures stuff comes into this. And that's a very powerful way to start to understand not just how we might use these tools, but how they might impact the context in which we work. They all have positives, they all have negatives. They might create new vulnerabilities at the same time as they can help us to address them. And I think that that gives us a really powerful role to play. I think that was mentioned in here as well, the role we can have in perhaps shaping the ethics of these things to ensure that they're not doing additional harm, that perhaps communities, contexts, types of situation in which don't register on the tech company's radar when they develop and deploy these things are present and are visible. And I think that that's the bridge we can take, where perhaps what we're able to do is create a bridge between the kind of experience, the lived experience of humanitarian vulnerability and crisis, and the reality of delivering effective services in those situations, and the expertise that exists in the tech sector. There's often a big gap in understanding between those two ends of the spectrum. And I think we can play a real role in helping connect and sensitize both ends and get the best out of the technology in a way that really helps improve our service delivery, but ultimately improves and helps and is suitable and welcomed by the people that we are helping, the people those services are designed to help. So yeah, really powerful to see all this stuff coming through. And there's some great questions, so I'd really like to turn to some of those. But please also, feel free to put your hands up in the chat and ask if anything else comes up as we are talking about this stuff. So there was a really interesting question where did it go? I like the question that was raised. So it was asked, it would be interesting to understand the role of values in this work. Do we think it's in the interest of the sector for these technologies to emerge, or do we see that as a neutral thing? How do we play a role in shaping and questioning the value of these technologies? And I'll open that up to anybody on the panel who'd like to jump in.
Sorry, I was trying to unmute myself. Shruti, I don't know if the work in terms of ethics resonates with the question of values.
Yeah. I mean, the reality is that these technologies are being used already, right? Whether I think there's a longer debate about when or in what form these technologies can actually be useful. And there are definitely instances in which some of these technologies have had adverse consequences, right? So, but having said that, the reality is these technologies are on the ground, whether in pilot forms, whether in ways that they're shaping overall operation of humanitarian organization that's already there. I think, I always find it very difficult to sort of say value neutral because I don't think that exists, right? We are all coming in with certain biases, certain understandings of how these technologies, or at least specific types of technologies, can be used. I think what can be useful for the humanitarian sector is to talk about what sorts of values or what sorts of principles can shape the use of this technology, rather than debating whether the technology should be used at all. Because I think in some of these cases that has already sailed. I think there are some instances where there is sort of international pressure to develop guidance. So in one of the workshops, someone had mentioned the use of robot dogs, right? And or robotic warfare was something that the international community had long been working in the UN to prevent the use of that. But having said that, we've already seen the use of that. So, there are definitely technologies that are worrying for us to see being used. But having said that, they're already being used. So can we shape how they're being used rather than whether they should be used or not? Does that, I don't know who asked that question, but does that somewhat get to your point? I can't see who has asked that question, Ben. I don't know if
I think it was anonymous in the chat, but
Okay.
Yeah, and maybe if I can add, I think we've seen kind of a similar considerations when we look at biometrics, that within the sector, some of the kind of missteps or kind of trial and error that has happened has led some organizations to kind of reconsider their position on the use of biometrics, but to realize a few years later that being out of the conversation can be more damaging to the adoption and development of technologies for affected communities, and that being able to shape the discussion from within can sometimes be quite helpful. And going back to the question of biases, I think perhaps even more during the AI focused project, this has come across, but no technology is neutral in itself. It's developed by human beings who have biases. Do they realize it or not? That's a different question, I think. But I think we all have our biases, and our experiences inevitably kind of feed into that as well. So having more open discussion about the use of technologies, and I think that's really why the points about considering the ethical implications of these technological developments is really important, because the unintended consequences of using emerging technologies in crisis-affected contexts can be really damaging. And I think we see that on the news every day at the moment. So yeah, I think if hopefully that also contributes to answering the question.
Thank you. Yeah, I think Shruti, she said in the presentation that tech doesn't operate in a vacuum, right? Everything triggers unintended consequences. There can be a shadow to even the best seeming thing, and it's important that we're there to kind of recognize that and perhaps champion a spotlight attention on addressing some of those unintended consequences. But I also agree that there is we don't have the power to put things back in the bottle after they've arrived. I remember when drones first started being widely used by militaries, and there was a lot of debate in the humanitarian sector about the ethics of even using them as they emerged from the military, and there was fears of re-traumatizing populations who had been exposed to drones as weapons. And now it's not really even questioned that drones are a powerful potential tool for our operations. They've been repurposed, rethought, and worked into our purpose. And I think that's a lesson, but that's going to happen time and again with these technologies. I also think we can and should play a role in the early stages of these stuff. Like we see debate happening now around the ethics of AI and the biases built into it, etc. That's a powerful role that we can play based on our mandate and our position in the sector. Sorry.
I would just then just to add one, right? Completely agreeing with what you and Pauline said. But I think the one important bit to talk about in how values and the use of AI is often there's a tendency within a lot of us in the sector to talk about it as happening to a community that we are not part of, right? Because we are sitting in different spaces and talking about how this will impact somebody else. So I think truly building, and I know this is difficult given how structures are set up, but having representatives from that community talk about and imagine how these technologies will impact them, rather than doing it as an afterthought and saying, whoops, we did this and now we've learned from it.
Yeah, and that's the phrase frugal innovation was used throughout this presentation, which is refreshing to hear as well, because it had a moment, that concept, and then it seemed to have died away. But it's the genius of problem solving at a local level and a recognition that problems have their unique characteristics and people are capable and often are already solving problems in very sophisticated ways. And that isn't always recognized or used, even by humanitarian organizations who should know better, and certainly not by tech companies who might detool something they've made for another market and try and resell it somewhere else. But building from the bottom up and building on what's there is a very, very powerful way to use these emerging technologies. I'm seeing some positive comments in the chat around that as well. And exactly, don't underestimate people, involve people from the beginning. So there was other questions in the chat, if I can look. So James, there was a question when you were speaking. Sorry, I caught you while you were drinking a glass of water then. But look at the specifics of the deployment of some of this. There's a question which said, so how do you tally up the likelihood of digital twins of camps or advanced smart city tech, given the kind of reality of financial constraints for refugee support? So my reading of that question is, is it even realistic to be talking about these things on the horizon when perhaps we're struggling to fund the basics today?
Yeah, I'm going to pass part of that off to Pauline because I think she'll probably have a pretty useful perspective here. But I would say it is kind of valuable when doing this futures work to kind of be looking at these different kind of horizons at the same time. What are the things that are in place right now that we can kind of try and steer the development of? And then also what are the kind of future developments, like you were saying earlier, that we might want to have a role in shaping as they kind of, or kind of in discussing as they kind of become potentially relevant for the humanitarian sector. But yeah, I think I'll pass the rest to Pauline because you may have a different perspective.
No, thanks, Jim. I think that's helpful. I think for the kind of because I see there are a couple of questions related to how the Three Horizon framework were developed and what this means kind of in practice. So in terms of like the framework in general, we considered the Three Horizons for each of the 5 technology areas that were developed as kind of deep dive areas. And basically, we tried to understand first what was the current context in which these were already used in the sector, and that's kind of Horizon 1 and kind of present day. And then in terms of like what could happen in the future, we're not saying at all that this is going to happen. This is not trying to predict the future. And as Ben well knows, foresight methods are not trying to predict a specific future, but more to give you an idea of what the possible futures could look like. And there's a range of possibilities that the factors we've identified could go into one direction or another, and we're not kind of indicating a specific direction of change, if that makes sense, but more to give you a sense of potential developments that could happen in the sector. So hopefully that answers one of the questions. And in terms of like a specific horizon, there's no kind of specific time frame attached to them. The main challenge when you do that is to give yourself a kind of end date. What is the date you're looking to understand the development of technologies out of? So in the context of this project, it was 2030, which is, I guess, still a long time for the humanitarian sector. But in terms of like futures and foresight in general, that could be considered a shorter time frame, if that makes sense, because we can look into, I don't know, 2050, 2060, 2100. Like there's no kind of limit as to what horizon you can put yourself against, but then it's trying to understand from the present and that future you've identified, what is the middle bit that could take like months, but could also take years, if not decades, to develop. But it's really trying to identify the factors that are either going to help you achieve that future or that could hamper the development of that direction of change that you're trying to identify. So for example, some like regulations and new laws about kind of AI, etc., is likely to affect some of the technologies beyond the specific deep dive areas that we've considered. But these are not necessarily going to, again, there could be unintended consequences of these, or the sector could adapt should these regulations come into place and then foster other developments. That's kind of the beauty of foresight, is that uncertainty is completely embedded in the way you anticipate the future and approach the future, I guess. So going back to the specific question about smart cities, I think it was, or digital twin for camps. I think we don't necessarily see this at the moment in terms of it being a certain development or direction of change, but it's more like this is an option. And should this be considered valuable for the sector, what are the necessary steps in terms of like finding the financial resources to develop this, work together with the tech sector, to make sure that these are developed in a way that will not compromise the data collected from people who live in those camps or from organizations that do manage the camps, and what are the potential trade-offs or risk associated with data tampering or leaks of data, or what are the potential consequences. I think what we really want to emphasize is that any futures work that being done is to, and I think this is really good to see those questions, because it's really about prompting the questions and fostering the thinking about what should we be thinking about should any future or horizon start to materialize. So I hope that answers the various questions that were in the chat about this.
I think you covered quite a few of the questions there. It's good. But I think that's an important point. Foresight work is not necessarily very rarely about delivering definite answers. It's about asking better questions. And by spotting the signs of change, those weak signals that something may become possible and may become a powerful force, it allows us to explore it early, to imagine the scenarios that might come about because of that, and engage with them now. And that's not just a kind of vanity exercise, because you can work it backwards to today, and there may be some very powerful questions that need to be answered or addressed. We did this in the early days of the Ukraine crisis and developed a scenario-based assessment of how it might unfold over sort of 5 years. And within that, we spotted some very early signs of technology being used in ways that we hadn't seen before in those kind of conflict situations. And we were quickly able to kind of extrapolate from that, consider how it might evolve, and raise those issues with our operational teams. You know, I was nervous to do it, to go to people dealing with a war, like as it was happening, but they were very grateful for sight of these big issues that were based on the things we were seeing happening in that particular instance. So there's huge value, I think. Maybe it's a chance for me to drop my own advert in here. I send you a link to the book that we produced on using foresight in the humanitarian context, because it explains a lot of the stuff that Pauline's just been talking about. How do you get value out of using these things? That's probably a little segue into the question that touched on the use of things like Starlink for humanitarian connectivity, because in that particular context, that was a very important, and it is still an important thing, but it was also switched off and on at the will, seemingly, of a single individual. And that's a hugely influential, almost foreign policy choice by a tech company. And I saw that you shared some links relating to discussion of this, which is hugely appreciated. But how do we unpack that kind of knotty issue about our engagement with these tech companies, and how do we perhaps leverage the power that we have as the humanitarian sector to ensure that technology is not, well, what would be used to manipulate the outcomes of humanitarian crises? Is that a role for us, or should we not be getting too involved?
So maybe just to clarify, I don't believe we used at the specific example of Starlink in the context of this project. But I think the discussions that we had about making sure that there are engagements with the tech sector and private sector funding and development is really important in terms of, again, ensuring that should there be any unintended consequences of the deployment of technologies, these are kind of considered, but also to increase the sensitivity of the tech sector to the humanitarian principles, especially when these technologies are deployed in a context of war. As you mentioned, Ben, I think Ukraine has been an incredible incubator of technological development. And I attended a conference yesterday that did mention that there were Ukrainian stakeholders mentioning that tech companies and defense companies were kind of invited to come to Ukraine to kind of test their own technological developments, because the administrative burden that they have is quite minimal, and they're able to put technological developments to the battlefield within 6 months, including in relations to drones. But I think at the same time, if we go back to the example of Starlink, they were able to fill a gap very fast in Ukraine on the battlefield to ensure that communications could sustain in the middle of like drone strike and missile strikes from Russia. So yeah, I think it's important for all parties involved in technological developments and its deployment in conflict affected context to come together. But I guess sometimes the kind of urgency, and I think that also kind of goes back to the values questions we touched upon previously, that again, it's human beings behind the technology.
Yeah.
I don't know if anyone else from the team wants to add it.
I mean, one of the in the workshops that we conducted, one of the things that came across was exactly what we're discussing now, right? Like these technologies are often used in or developed in different contexts, and then they sort of get used within humanitarian contexts later, right? And I think it is important for us as a community to talk about who developed this technology, why did they do it, and who is then going to benefit from it. I don't think we should avoid it at all. There are sort of conversations around how should this technology be used? Should humanitarian sectors buy this technology, right? Like what, do they have to give the data back, or are they allowing tech companies to use this technology under the aegis of the humanitarian sector? So what is the ownership that the humanitarian organization that's using this technology has over it is really important. And I think it's important for us not to hand it off to tech companies, because then we can see like, Starlink can be turned on and off, that data can be used in different ways. So discussing ownership of these technologies and ultimately accountability for these technologies, that's what it comes down to.
Thank you. I think that might take us nicely into some sort of final 5 minutes looking at just the practicalities. We've covered some huge issues, the ethics, interaction with different sectors, etc. But on a practical level, for the people on the call, I'd like to maybe each person who was on the panel to maybe give us your piece of advice. How would you start to experiment with these technologies, or to consider the potential impact on your, on an organization's work? What's your kind of top tip for people who want to engage further with these kind of, with the outcomes of your research? Well, I look scared now. Pauline, do you have some advice on practical application?
I think what we've come to realize during the research is that a lot is being done by different parts of the humanitarian sector, as well as some adjacent sectors like peace building, development, and they are cross-cutting lessons or practices that could be adapted and transferred into the humanitarian sector. So I think trying to assess whether this is an area where things have been done before and could be adapted either to a new context or to a new type of activity or to a new type of organization could be really valuable, because I think we all have a tendency to want to reinvent the wheel, but there is a lot that does exist already, and kind of learning from those who have tried to experience with these technologies already may be kind of useful, and also could help avoid replicate potential missteps or mistakes that could happen even as unconsciously as we look to deploy these technologies.
Thank you. Sergi Hampton, I see you come off mute, go for it.
Yeah, and just to piggyback off of what Pauline said, as sort of in the guidance that we presented, we put step 3 as guidance development. So individuals essentially using the guidance that we've developed to create their own guidance. And I think that speaks a lot to the connection of different stakeholders, both between different organizations, but also stakeholders within the same organization, to ensure that they're speaking the same language, as we mentioned. So having that guidance that's in a language that's accessible to everyone that's involved in the process. And that would sort of help connect those more strategic and operational sort of day-to-day roles. I think that's something that's really crucial.
Thank you. Does anybody else have any practical advice, or and anybody in the audience as well, to build on what Sian said in the chat? Do share with each other and with us the barriers and the lessons that you've learned trying to use this stuff. James, anybody? Final thoughts? Sian.
Well, if I may jump in, I think one of the other overarching things that I think I took away from this work is the importance of really starting with the problem and looking at learning across the landscape, really. I think, to the point that was raised before about, is technology bad or good? I think we have a tendency to kind of anthropomorphize technology itself. Often it comes down to these much more intrinsic aspects of the system, as Shruti has spoken to, of power, of funding, of coordination. And those are roles that I think we can all step into and play a role. And so for each of you who might be from organizations who are considering piloting technologies in relation to a particular problem, I would encourage you to be transparent as well and share what you're learning, share the frank struggles that you might be facing, share the failures, but also what's working. Because I think half of the time where we are struggling, we're struggling in isolation. But actually, if we start to talk about this a lot more, and that's hopefully some of the conversations we can facilitate via the hub, then I think we have a much more promising path forward in this regard.
Seems like a very good thought to wrap up on. Well, aware that we're hitting time. Is there anything that you guys would like to just share before people?
Maybe as people go off, we could just bring up the slides again, because we do have a few next steps that we wanted to flag. So it isn't the end of this work. So we will be, each of those deep dives that we mentioned, there will be opportunities where we'll try and convene a more specific group of stakeholders around each of those to figure out what kind of future actions there could be. We are also trying to pursue that foresight initiative that we flagged on the last slides. There's an email here for you to reach out to the RAND team or other members of the team that have contributed to this work, and we encourage you to do that. And then on the next slide, I think, we just wanted to also mention, as we have in the chat, that one of the challenges, I think, is that technologies and AI, that they are fast-moving topics. There's a lot out there written, and it's quite hard to navigate the hype, particularly for sort of frontline program managers in the humanitarian sector. And there's a tendency, if you don't quite know the space, to just step out of it. And we really want to avoid that. We want to encourage people to try and strengthen their own capacities and familiarity with this topic. We don't want you to become experts. That's not the role of humanitarians, but we want to help you to be able to ask the right questions, really. And so we're developing a newsletter. This is a collaboration with the Humanitarian Innovation Fund and several other partners, including NetHope and Humanitarian AI Today. And we would encourage you to, and also Rebecca, who I think is on this call, who is helping curate this newsletter for us. And we're really hoping that this can be a way of bringing together all of the kind of latest insights on these different topics in a way that's digestible for humanitarians. So if you're interested in listening in via podcast, reading some case studies, and becoming more familiar with this work, then I encourage you to sign up. The first edition will be coming in at the end of this month.
Brilliant, thank you. Pauline, is that the end of, are we?
Yeah, I think that's the end. Thanks everyone for joining, and thank you for all of the questions that you shared. The link to the various documents that we've published as part of this project is in the chat if you want to further engage. And again, we remain available should you have any questions. And thank you everyone for joining us today. This was really interesting.